Welcome and thanks for joining the Stanford High Weekly Seminar on Smart Interfaces for Human-Centered AI with James Landay. As a reminder, we'll take questions from the audience through Slido. Please click on the Q&A link on the website, or it's in the chat, or you can scan the QR code on the screen right now. James Landay is the Anand Rajaraman and Venki Harinarayan Professor in the School of Engineering and a Professor of Computer Science who specializes in human-computer interaction. James is also an Associate Director of Stanford High and one of HAI's earliest faculty leaders. James, please share your slides and begin.
Okay, here we go. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yes, looks good.
Thanks. All right, thanks for having me to give this seminar talk today. I work in the fields of human-computer interaction, ubiquitous computing, and AI. And today I'm going to speak about the intersection between these fields and the need for a more human-centered view of artificial intelligence. I'm going to start by giving you 3 examples of why I think the AI and user experience design problems are harder when we look at applications that include these technologies. So first, we'll start with autonomous cars. So many of you have seen the Tesla Model S and have either driven or heard about its autopilot feature. There's a lot of AI in this type of vision of autonomous cars, especially in computer vision to figure out what's around the car and to drive safely. And this future of autonomous cars, I think there's maybe some dispute about when it might happen. Elon Musk may want you to believe it's happening today, and maybe the major car companies think it's more like 15 to 20 years before this really works well enough to think about it for most of our driving. The real answer is probably somewhere in the middle, because it's actually a hard problem. But there's a lot of issues in terms of what should the user experience be in this type of autonomous car. So what should the user see on the dashboard? So for example, this image on left is what is seen behind the steering wheel in the Tesla automobile. So you can see the car in the lane, and you can see how the system might be seeing a car ahead of it, and behind and to the right of it. In the middle of, between the 2 seats in the front of the Tesla, there's actually a large display, almost like a large tablet that users have to interact with. Unfortunately, lots of that use really requires your eyes. This is a great place for multimodal and voice control, which I'm sure people are working on. But the big question in these kind of systems is, what happens when things go wrong, which they obviously already have. People have lost their lives. And we can debate whether these cars are safer than cars where we have people driving them, especially when they're impaired or tired. But we're still going to want them to work as well as they can. So let's say that system's in an autonomous mode, but it's starting to be less confident in its decisions with the data it's seeing, maybe due to weather or road it hadn't seen before. How do we start to get the user ready to take over? How do we have them ready so that if they do have to take over, it's not a sudden thing where they're going to react too slowly? Those are all questions about user experience, and they're harder with an autonomous car than with one where the user's more fully in control. Here's another domain that many of us may have experienced if we're not wealthy enough to afford that Tesla car. So these smart speakers like the Amazon Echo, Google Home, or the Baidu DuerOS, or other smart speakers that are out there, use a voice interface to allow us to talk to an intelligent agent or somewhat intelligent. They let us easily speak to our devices. So we can command them to do simple things like, what's the answer of 88 by 24? Notice I didn't say the wake word since I have one sitting right next to my desk. Or what's the time? Or in my house, it's often set a timer while cooking. So those are fairly simple things. But as of now, more natural human conversations are quite hard to do. A give back and forth between you and who you're speaking with, in this case, the agent, or that there's a shared understanding of knowledge of the world or things that you've said before so that you don't have to repeat it every time. Right now, it's almost like this is a new random person you've just met every time, and they don't remember anything much that you said to it before, and they don't have much knowledge of the world. So how do we get to more of this natural human conversation? Obviously, a lot of that is underlying AI, natural language processing, but even what is the right interface that will be natural in these situations, and how to deal with, for example, when it breaks down, instead of just saying, I don't know the answer to that, what could we do better? And then it gets a little harder as these devices start to fit in with more of our computing ecosystem. So you can imagine things like this Echo Show that has a display as well as a microphone and speaker, and maybe it even has a camera. So we want to be able to start to have what I would call multimodal inputs and outputs. So we could have touch, we could speak to it, we could gesture maybe. And what happens when these devices are blown up into multiple devices? So let's say I have a big display on the wall here in my kitchen, and maybe I have something on my fridge, and I have my phone, and I have some device like this. How do we interact across all those devices in a really natural way? And how does a programmer or a designer even think about that design, not knowing exactly what configuration of devices that any one individual has in their home? So that starts to become more complex as well in terms of what the user experience is or how to build it. The last example I'll show you very quickly is in the health domain. There's been many research studies starting to show that AI-based skin cancer detection is close to that of an expert. Now, I'd say take some of these results with a grain of salt, but this is something that probably will happen someday. And again, some of the user experience questions, what's appropriate to show to a patient? So if the system is 30% confident that something that you took a picture of on your skin is cancer, should it show that to the patient? What should it say? If it's 80% confident, should it say something else? Should it show the same thing? And what should it show or send to the doctor? Should the interface be the same, or the information the same, or should it be different? Again, these are really the types of AI and UX questions I'm interested in moving forward. And we want to really see, is there even some kind of general design patterns for these smart UIs that will allow people to understand what systems are doing that have AI under the hood across different applications, or is there really just going to be different interactions and ways of expressing it that are purely domain dependent? So at this point, I think these applications and problems really, in some ways, raise more questions than answers. So some of the important questions, for example, are how do we help people become better at their tasks and activities? So better at writing, or better at design, better at healthcare, better at learning, better at art. And how will people communicate with these AI agents and systems? So I showed you one example or discussed about multimodal interaction across multiple devices. Well, that will require some design patterns for what works, and design tools that will help designers who are going to try to span a variety of devices and different contexts. And then how do we find a balance between instructing systems on every small action or giving up total control to an automated system? So there is some early work out there on things like design guidelines, which can make best practices clear, or heuristics, which can be used in a more formal evaluation process to help design teams assess the issues in an intelligent UI. And I point to these two papers, especially this guidelines for human AI interaction from Salima Amarishi and colleagues, mainly at Microsoft and also University of Washington, is a really good first start. But we're just really starting to see the early days of this, and we want to go beyond. For example, how do we make the important interface metaphors, or invent them, that will make understanding and using these systems easier, as did the WIMP metaphor for the GUI? Maybe we won't, maybe there won't be one. But I think this is an interesting question that speaks to the time we're in right now in this AI revolution. So I want to show you in the rest of this talk 3 application areas where my research is starting to run into some of these issues. And again, I wouldn't say we've solved them yet. We're just really starting to explore them. So I'll start first with some of the projects that involve underlying AI that we've done in the general space of health. And in health, human behavior is at the root of many of our biggest problems. So for example, the balance between eating and exercise. In this example, what you see is a map of the United States in 1990 from the Center for Disease Control. And what we're seeing is states with a BMI or body mass index greater than or equal to 30, which is an important point because that's considered clinically obese. And that's, people with weight and BMI above that is where we start to see correlation with obviously diabetes, but also heart disease and cancer. And so we can see in 1990 for the states they had data, there were a few states, the ones in gray, those 6 states, they didn't have data that year, but quickly they'd had data by the next year. We see that most of the population was not clinically obese. So we see less than 10% in many of those dark green states and 10 to 15% in the rest of the states that we see there. Now, if we animated this over the years, you'll just see this dramatic way it changes. I'm just going to skip ahead 20 years to 2010, and we can see that the map is completely orange, and it's just a difference in shade. And so we can see about a third of the states were over 30%, a third were 25 to 30, and a third were 20 to 25. If you roll forward another 10 years, they changed the methodology, but pretty much the numbers kept going up, and it seems like it's leveled out as of today. About 43% of the US adult population is clinically obese. So you might say, oh, is this just aging the population? No, we saw similar trends with children, and it seems as the children did level out in the last few years, and that was a result that was hailed, but still at these very high rates. So AI has been proposed as one way to help people with this, especially on the exercise side of the equation. So the idea of using AI in fitness devices to track people's activities in the physical world and then feed it back to them is one way that people have thought to work on this problem. And in fact, I worked on this problem when I led a research lab for Intel back in the early 2000s, where we built a device that could track your physical fitness and give you feedback on a phone. And eventually that got built into phones and smartwatches and things like this. The problem is these don't seem to really work. Studies have shown that about a third of the people abandon these fitness devices after about 3 months, and about 50% abandon after 6 months. And they don't abandon them because, hey, I've suddenly run my marathon now and I'm all great. I'm in a pattern of good fitness behavior. They abandon them because these devices in some ways just remind them that they're not meeting the goals that they've set for themselves. So there's some cognitive dissonance that's going on there. And in fact, in many ways, these technologies tend to be not very engaging, and so they don't keep people in there. So we've been trying to attack this engagement issue by using the idea of narrative or story. So we combine long-term stories with ambient feedback in this application we call Huizuki. This is a really early sketch of the story. The character Zuki is from another planet and goes through several adventures as he looks for his lost brother on Earth. And so I'm going to show you a little more about this. So the idea is that as you meet your goals for the week, you get to the next chapter in the story. And the story is mainly a visual story, though there's some text that comes as you meet major goals. But the story is this visual display, what we call an ambient display, meaning it's always visible on the lock screen of the phone. It's on the background screen when you unlock your phone. And so the user can see it almost unconsciously every time they glance at their phone or unlock their phone, which studies have shown is over 200 times per day. So we're trying to take advantage of those glances so that people are more aware of what they're doing or not doing. So you can see here in the middle image, we see the character moving in this balloon and it's going up, but you see these birds appearing across the top. So every time somebody does another physical activity, let's say you took a walk for 20 minutes or went out and run or took a bike ride, another bird appeared. And as you hit every 20% of your weekly goal, that main image changed somewhat. So we see the change in how the balloon is going up, and we see a progress bar at the bottom showing those things. And if you meet your goal for the week, then you get to the next chapter as you see on the right. So I'm going to show you this is what it will look like on the lock screen on Android. A lot of the design had to go around how do you keep the important content away from notifications. So a lot of the important things like the birds are at the top and the progress bars at the bottom, because a lot of the notifications will end up in the middle. After you unlock your phone, you see the whole home screen wallpaper where we can see it again. And then finally, if you run the app itself, you'll see it, as well as you can set your goals and see your progress in more detail, and things like that. So now I'm going to show you a brief video, just to give you an idea how this works. So we'll do this for about 40 seconds here.
Ambient displays on the background screen of phones have shown to be a good way to sustain behavior change by increasing self-awareness through many glances a day. However, a single scene that resets each week can become monotonous after a short time. We explored using a multi-chapter visual narrative as a way to sustain engagement with an ambient display over an extended period. A user who meets their goal for the week is able to move on to the next chapter in the story. The Huazuki narrative includes 13 different chapters, textual transitions, and the key components of a narrative, including a start, a middle, and an end, as well as a sympathetic protagonist and antagonist, and challenges that must be overcome.
So that's the basics for the Zuki application. So let me now show you what happened when we evaluated it. So I thought having multiple chapters versus one chapter that just kept repeating every week. So you'd be in one chapter and see things change, but on Sunday morning, it would start over again. I thought multi-chapters would be more engaging, seemed kind of the obvious thing. So first, what we did is we ran a 3-week pilot study with 16 people where we compared just a smaller, this way, 3-chapter version versus single chapter. This is mainly to kick the tires, look for bugs, but also see if we're starting to see what we expect with this design. We did see that the people in the single chapter condition, their engagement with the app, their use of it, et cetera, dropped even over only a 3-week study. We also found that people who were ranked higher on a narrative engagement scale with the story, so we tested how engaged they were, the more you were engaged with the story, the more physical activity they did. And then the people who are in this multi-chapter condition actually logged more exercise, had a better mood, and showed more positivity towards exercise. So these are things that we'd really want to see in a real study. So in some ways, narrative seems to be the key, with multiple chapters boosting positive and buffering negative effects over time. And so in fact, we're now in the middle of analyzing the data from a 6-month study where we had around 40 to 50 people in those 2 conditions testing it, and we saw similar results. So we're still writing that up and analyzing the data. So some of the research questions: do multi-scene stories lead to longer engagement? We think these 2 studies are showing that's true. Some further out research that we'd like to do, and some of my original goals when I started the project, was about sustainability. I originally thought of Huazuki as something that combines sustainability with physical activity, because I had found the idea of a sustainability application really didn't have a lot of interest. The only people who'd want to run it are people who are really highly motivated about sustainability, and you might need to help them improve just a little bit, but how do we get to the other 80% of the population? So one idea is combining sustainability with physical activity, and we want to compare whether that works better than a sustainability app by itself. And then another issue is cultural feedback. So a lot of the feedback in these systems that we've built have been positive. You do something good, you get positive in terms of the story, but we never, like, for example, make the tree die in one of these applications if you didn't do the work. But I found in prior research I did in China that that feedback can be culturally appropriate. So sometimes maybe in certain cultures, negative feedback can have a bigger impact. And we saw that in one of the studies we've run, but I'd like to run a study where we really control the positive and negative feedback to see if it's culturally dependent. So another project where we look at AI and how it's impacted is in education. And so again, this is one area that I started to work on when I spent 2.5 years on sabbatical in Beijing. And at the time, China, I think, had shown the world that it can produce anything, including highly educated kids. They'd built thousands of computer science departments, over 700 design schools, and they beat the rest of the world on this middle school examination called the PISA when I was living there between 2010 and 2012. And although they came in first place on this exam, I was surprised that a lot of people in China I talked to didn't really find much comfort in that result. They felt like the system was really good at producing kids who could do well in these standardized tests and had a good grasp of the fundamentals, but they were more worried about that the system was really leading to conformity and efficiency rather than innovation. And in fact, this was the time right after the iPad had come out and they had done a teardown and found out of the $600 or $700 that this cost, Apple got about $250 to $300, and another 200 or so dollars went to Korea and Japan for the chips and displays. And that in China, where they were actually building the device, assembling the device, they were only getting somewhere around $10 to $15 of that. And so there was a real push to think about how can we innovate more and be the ones creating the products rather than just assembling them. So there was really this kind of lack of balance that they felt the education system was too over on one side. In the US, it was almost the opposite. Folks were upset that we didn't do well on the exam. And there were results like this from the Broad Foundation, where they said 68% of US 8th graders can't read at grade level, and most will never catch up. And you never hear much about, oh, American kids aren't creative or innovative. You hear more, hey, we can't do the basics and math and reading and science and things like that. So it felt like both sides of these countries felt they were out of balance in different ways, and had me start to think about education. I started to think about how school is not really personalized to the students, and that a significant segment of kids are unmotivated in the traditional one-size-fits-all education that was created maybe as a scalable way to supply factory workers during the Industrial Revolution. And I started to think about a novel I had read when I was in graduate school, which was called The Diamond Age by the science fiction author Neal Stephenson. And in this novel, he really gave the story of what is in the subtitle, A Young Lady's Illustrated Primer, which was a smart tablet-like device that had a narrative story that was personalized to the kid who was reading it, personalized to their education level, but also to where they lived in the world and what was going on in their family. And she read the story for years and learned really at the start how to read, how to write, math, science, stranger danger, martial arts, all these life skills as well as traditional educational skills. And at the time I read that novel, along with my colleagues and grad students who were some of the best AI people in the world at the time at Carnegie Mellon, we thought this would be impossible. It would require perfect AI, or what today people might refer to as AGI. But when the iPad came out, 15 years later than that novel, in 2010, and I saw it, I said, wow, that really is the device that I imagined when I read it. And I started to think about what would it take to build this type of thing, or something that motivated by the story. And so, my idea was, could we have a narrative like device that had a story, but also had fun and engaging learning activities embedded in it, that kids had to do these things often in the real world, not just behind a screen, to move the story along. So for example, maybe these kids here have tapped on that frog and made it jump, and they've put blue tape on the floor to see where it landed, and now they're measuring the distances and they're going to calculate the average. Or this kid in Seattle is measuring, how much rainwater they get in a week or in 6 months in Palo Alto, and is logging that and trying to measure it. So instead of spending the next 10 years building such a thing, what my research group usually does is we start to write a script, and we make a movie of what we think this future vision might be like. And so I'm going to show you the original film that was made by some Stanford undergraduates working with me. And it doesn't mean we do everything that's in the movie, but it allows us to, one, explore our ideas without spending the years building it, and two, show it to other people to get their feedback, and that leads to change. And in fact, this film did that. So let's play this. This is about 2 minutes. So, we start with a caricature of the learning system in some schools where, you're expected to just copy what the teacher does. But we really want to think about getting outside and learning in the real world. one thing I noticed about in school, when my kids were young kids and they wrote, they didn't get a lot of feedback on their writing. So could we get feedback from the system right away, or from other kids who are using the tool? Could we take advantage of landmarks in the real world and somehow embed that in the story and make it more interesting depending where you live? So here she's learning about earthquakes based on this wall that was built from bricks from the Loma Prieta earthquake. Or can we take advantage of objects that you could find around the home and do things with them to learn more? So in this case, slicing an orange and learning about pi. Or can we use the device as almost an investigative device and investigate things to the world? Excuse me. And then finally, it shouldn't be only one kid at a time. How do different kids interact together when using this device? And as the child gets older, they have more control on where they go and what they learn and ask. So this effort's really been a joint project with a lot of students over the years, and especially some of my colleagues like Professor Emma Brunskill, who are experts in some of the AI that we're using. So the basic overview of the project is that we try to combine narrative, so a story, but we embed these fun educational activities. It runs on a personal media like a tablet or a phone. And then we use physical surroundings and location and context to make it more engaging and personalized to the student. So that last part you might think of as like Pokemon Go for education, though we were working on that before Pokemon Go. So what does a current story look like? So here's an example. Let's walk through a chapter. So the child and his or her adventure partner will appear as the main protagonist in a story. They read the story, and at some point in the story, they get to some learning activity. So in this case, they meet a boat captain and they're asking if they can get a ride across this river they're trying to cross. And the boat captain says he has this box of chocolate that he needs to carry, and he's not sure he can handle their weight. And so they need to calculate the volume and the weight of the chocolate box. And they don't have a scale, so they're going to figure this out by knowing how much one chocolate weighs and the size. And so they have to go through and essentially solve this volume problem and put an answer in. So after testing this prototype with almost a dozen kids, 10 to 12 years old, we found that it was too long for some kids, it was too hard for some kids, and too easy for others. And in fact, as expected, their reading levels, their sophistication, and their general interest varied. So really, you do want this personalization that we didn't yet have and still don't have as much. We've since revised and iteratively tested the different stories in terms of complexity with different kids. But building this first prototype really raised some interesting questions for us, research questions that we're now following on in the next versions of the Smart Primer. So one important question is, what do you do when they get stuck? So if kids using this kind of at home on their own time, we don't see this really as a replacement for school, but if they're using it and they don't have a teacher or a parent to help them, what do you do? So one thing we've been working on is having a tutoring bot, an agent that can provide hints and help this child when they get stuck. They can be adaptive. In the future, you might try to understand when the student's frustrated and be better in your adaptation, though understanding emotion is hard and fraught with other issues. So will this idea even work? Well, again, we try to test things before even building. So in this case, we tested it by using a Wizard of Oz methodology where we had a human remotely act as the chatbot and follow a script of what they're allowed to do at any point in time. So it was something we felt could be implemented in a chatbot. And we had 4 conditions in the study. And the first condition was just the educational task with none of the extra help or narrative or chatbots. The second, condition B, was the educational task embedded in narrative. The third, condition C, was educational task and narrative, but also a hint system. And this is like what kids would see today in something like Khan Academy. Essentially, they can ask for a hint, and there's just a linear sequence of hints, and they can keep going through them till they get what they need if they're stuck. And then finally, the condition that is what we believe would work is D. So an educational task plus the narrative, and then a chatbot that can help when they're stuck, as well as offer encouragement. So we tested this with 72 grade 3 to 5 kids who were evenly distributed across these conditions. And so what did we find? So first, the narrative-based learning was more engaging. So condition D in particular and condition B both had higher engagement scores than the control, condition A. We had some issues, I think, with the hint system of version in condition C, and didn't see a significant difference there. More importantly, the chatbot condition in particular showed learning gains for one of the more complex concepts, so calculating the volume. So you can see only for condition D, the chatbot condition, did we get a statistically significant effect versus the control, condition A, and this was for the volume problem. Also important was that the learning improvements persisted 30 days later. So on the left is kind of showing the different steps in solving the problem. And we can see really going from step 3 to 4, there's a big drop off in that volume problem. The last 2 steps are quite easy. Really that step is where the big leap is. And you can see the top 2 lines are really the task, with the chatbot is the red one, and the one below it is the one with the hints, because you could just go through the hints to find the answer. And you can see a similar thing 30 days later, there's still a gap between that red line and the ones below it that is significant. And if you see in a post test, you see the same kind of learning differences, just smaller at that point. So the important question is, can we build that for a real chatbot and get similar results? Because that was all great, but it was a Wizard of Oz. So what we did next was to build an automated chatbot using reinforcement learning. So the idea here is that the reinforcement learning algorithm determines what message to provide to the students given their natural language inputs. It requires 0 training data, and we used a policy based on the PPO algorithm. We also, due to COVID, had to shift from this kind of in-lab experiment on tablets to building a web-based version that could be run at home. So we had to re-implement that whole thing, as well as implementing the RL chatbot in the system. We did a user study this time of 339 kids from grade 3 to 5. You need some more data really if you're going to get reinforcement learning to work in an online study. And then the RL chatbot could do a batch update to its policy after every 5 kids. So there were 269 kids in the RL condition and 70 kids in the control. And we really had 4 actions that the RL agent could choose from to give feedback to the student. So one is guided prompting, something like try thinking about the concept of volume to solve this problem. A second was providing a direct hint like we'd seen in Khan Academy or in our previous system. So, hey, here's the formula for area if somebody's stuck. Sending encouragement. You've just about got it. Don't give up yet. Obviously, we had a bunch of different messages that we could randomly choose from. And then simply acknowledging receipt, just some feedback that I heard what you said. So those were the different action space for the RL. So what did we find out? We found that children learning with the chatbot yielded higher learning gains than those learning with the control. This was statistically significant, but the effect size was small. But if we look at the data more closely, we can see that children who had no or little prior knowledge, i.e. people who did poorly on the pretest, benefited much more by interacting with the chatbot. So you'll see for those kids that the effect size is large, 1.13, and we still had a positive effect for kids who did better on the pretest, just not as large again, so more modest. And we also see that the kids with the chatbot, just like in our prior study, were more engaged. So again, we see a small to modest effect size there in the difference. This time we're using the Giggle Gauge, which was particularly an engagement scale designed and validated for children. And again, if we look at those kids with little prior knowledge, they were engaged the most with a fairly large effect size again. So the results of the real chatbot were about the same as what we got with the Wizard of Oz, maybe slightly smaller on the effect size. I think one thing is the policy and the RL was less smart about which hint to give when compared to our wizard. So when we did the Wizard of Oz, the wizard could choose which hint they thought was most relevant to the student at that time. We didn't do that in the RL. We didn't think we had enough data to do that. And so it's still just giving those hints in a linear order, but it's also choosing among those other kinds of feedback, and that seemed to help. What we're doing now is taking all the data from this study and seeing if we can use that to make an even better RL agent, and then we'll test it with kids again to see if we get even better results. So some of the research questions here. Does a compelling narrative motivate students to engage in learning activities? We think we've seen that as a positive in both studies. Can AI-based chatbots help students when they're stuck? And can we make a chatbot effective by targeting a problem domain? I think this last study has shown that. I'd like to show that more generally across more problems and more domains, but at least we're on the track for that next. And then one thing that we haven't shown yet that we've been working on is how can we best leverage context like location or objects in the real world, kind of think things like geocaching, go find an object somewhere, to make the story more engaging. We're working with augmented reality when you're out in the real world to tie the story into the real world. So those are the kind of things that we're working on still on this project that I again see as kind of a 10-year type of project rather than something we're doing in 2 or 3 years. So with my remaining few minutes, I'm just going to roughly run through one other more recent project that we've been working on here at Stanford. And it's another area in health beyond exercise, and it's in really the broader topic of wellness. And we started this project by noticing that many Americans are overstressed, overweight, sometimes feeling unmotivated or uninspired, wasteful or not good about the environment. Many people are unhappy, and many people feel isolated in their workplace or school, especially now with COVID, but even before that. And we spend much of our time with these afflictions I mentioned inside of the built environment. In fact, 87% of our time in homes and offices, according to the EPA. Again, this was data before COVID. So our model is that if we could look at building features, things like noise or unnatural light or artificial materials or the lack of access to nature, could we measure what their impact is on individual outcomes, things like stress, anxiety, and distraction, and then see how those might affect organizational outcomes like unproductive work, being wasteful or disconnected, and then finally, the associated societal outcomes. Now, it might seem hard to believe that buildings have this big an effect, so let me give you a concrete example. So in one study, they looked at absenteeism, which is a big problem. So people say they're sick and don't go to work. It costs companies an estimated $226 billion a year in the US, and this study looked at building features. Now, most of that absenteeism is likely due to long hours, low pay, and a lousy boss. But the type of office space actually matters. So in this study, they looked at just the lack of nature, and they showed how it led to higher stress, lower attention, and less engagement, and approximately 10% of that absenteeism. So maybe 23 billion in the US economy per year, just due to this lack of access to nature. So even if we could just have an impact of a few percent, it will be several $billion. So again, we made a video showing this workplace of the future. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time and just say, how do we get to this future where our buildings might be able to sense some of these things and adapt in a positive way? So what do we know already today? Well, we know that greenery can improve mood. So for example, here's a living wall that's a plant. And if you turn your head sideways, you'll kind of notice that it's a map of Central Park. There's evidence that the visual connection to nature lowers blood pressure and heart rate, improves mental engagement, and positively impacts mood, as I said. We know that natural lighting can lead to better concentration as well as increased productivity. And we know that social engagement can reduce stress. But there's less research on how buildings might impact this social inclusion. All of the studies behind the really nascent well building movement have been relatively small scale. They've also generally been short term, with fairly limited populations, and they are based on self-report, where let's say you're in a current building, you fill out a survey, and then a month later you move into a new building and they check with you a month later and have you fill out another survey. So we are trying to fill in the missing pieces in this puzzle and take a more integrated and scientific approach. And so how do we do this? For one, we want to establish that science. So we want to understand how particular building attributes impact occupant states in a naturalistic setting over long periods. We want to understand what the acceptance constraints are of people, because this is sensing technology. This can be considered surveillance. So which things are people willing to do, and how might we protect them in terms of what data they control or share? And then finally, what kind of digital and physical adaptations can we make based on that data to support well-being? Certain things that are dynamic really quickly, digital things, but even physical things where maybe the building management makes a change to something. So we've done a preliminary study just looking at some of these different aspects. In this case, we ran an online study with about 216 participants after we excluded folks who we didn't think were really doing it, half men and women. We showed them a series of pictures and told them, imagine you're starting a new job and the pictures depict the spaces and decoration in your new workplace. And then we asked them to answer a bunch of questions on their sense of belonging, their self-efficacy, and their environmental efficacy, some standard psychological surveys. And what was interesting is across the board, all three outcomes that we were interested in were significantly higher with natural materials, natural light, and diverse representations in the spaces. And the diverse representation condition was true for women in the first two cases, and actually the opposite for men. And then in the last case, it was true for everyone, but it was really driven by women and people of color. So we're still rerunning some of these to see if this holds. In the last condition, it's because our definition diverse actually included no white men. So there was actually kind of a pushback effect, I think, against that. We then ran a controlled lab study. We just recently finished this year-long study with over 400 people, where we systematically varied building features such as views to nature, natural light, artificial materials, and then diverse or non-diverse iconography on the wall. And so what did we find here? Well, we literally built, you can see some images showing what it looked like. We literally built a wall over the windows of one office, and then we systematically swapped out wood versus identical laminate furniture, and we systematically swapped out the pictures on the wall. And then we had people wearing smartwatch and Empatica device to be able to get other data, as well as fill out a lot of surveys and forms. And what did we find? Well, one, we found that the natural materials helped decrease the stress in the participants. That was seen both in the subjective report as well as in electrodermal or EDA sensed activity. So this was with the Empatica device. We could see that it was lower when they were in that condition. We also found positive effects of natural light on stress, though to a lesser extent. And we're still analyzing data on creativity, though so far we haven't seen any of the belonging effects that we saw in the Mechanical Turk study. And it could be possible it has to do with who our research participants were here, Stanford employees, and also what they were looking at in the room. So what might we do in a longer term study in naturalistic environments? We might vary things like views to nature, diverse symbols, as you saw there, airflow. We might have living walls or other nature in the environment. And then when varying these features, we really want to monitor these different outcomes. So stress, belonging, creativity, physical activity, and environmental behavior. So how do we measure that? So we start with self-report, but move beyond these kind of simple surveys people have done in the past and use experience sampling method, where we might just send a short survey question like, what is your stress level, 1 to 7, periodically during the day? And many have shown that ESM can reliably measure things like stress. And then we can use all the building data, the building sensors that have been put in for sustainability, which let us know how many people are in a room, or the energy used, or how much recycling or waste has occurred. And then finally, we can combine that with all of the personal devices that people carry and wear today, phones, watches, laptops. These are really sophisticated sensing devices that let us get at physical activity and stress through their physiological sensors. So by triangulating with ESM, building sensors, and personal devices, we can have a strong basis to make conclusions about how a building feature we are systematically varying is causing the outcomes we're measuring. So let me give you a couple of quick examples before I conclude. So here's one example. Kate is now in her new office. To measure her stress, we might look at the occupancy sensor just to understand how many people are around. We could use her non-speech-based conversational sensing from her phone to detect affect. You can do this in privacy-preserving ways. We can measure stress by how she's using her mouse or trackpad on her laptop. My former postdoc, Dr. Pablo Paredes, has done great work where we can show just with your trackpad movements whether someone's stressed or not. And then together with ESM data, if we ask a simple question, we can triangulate on our stress. We can do a similar thing like this for environmental behavior. Most of the technology we need is off the shelf. We need to re-implement existing algorithms and invent new technology as we go. But one of the big issues is about privacy. Because this data is highly personal and potentially sensitive, it's important to include both technical and non-technical approaches to privacy and security. So rather than just saying it will be secure, it will maintain privacy, we actually have a research agenda in privacy and thinking about it. So one is we use mixed method assessments with stakeholders to really understand what is their comfort level with collecting this type of data and explore different ways for individuals to communicate their privacy preferences to the building. Two, any studies we do are opt-in, and we always have ways for people to view and delete their data. And then three, from security, you have to secure the data and restrict the analysis and queries on a need-to-know basis. So some of the physical design adaptations are things like modular green walls. So those walls at left, you can literally take those pieces of greenery and move them to different places as needed. And this also allows you to change how the ventilation works. And so we're also looking at natural ventilation over time and indoor air quality. On the digital end, there's many different adaptations you might do. One that I like is this idea of dynamic ambient murals in public spaces and on personal devices. So imagine a wall where the colorful petals here are almost blowing in the wind from right to left. And so that might cause somebody to walk down the hall that way when they're going somewhere just to see where it's going. And that happens to be the way of the stairs rather than the elevator to the right, or that happens to be the way of a new colleague that they haven't met yet. And so in some ways, we're just kind of nudging the behavior there, but there's many different design ideas we could do. So some of the main research questions remaining on this pretty new project is, how do these building attributes, e.g. materials, light, and sound, impact occupant states in naturalistic settings over long periods? We've done online studies, we've done a controlled lab study, but what happens when we deploy some of the sensing and some of these study methodologies in real office settings over many weeks or months? Second is, how can we use AI to detect those occupant states, things like stress, creativity, belonging, without needing excessive self-report? Again, there's also ethical issues on detecting some of these kind of states. So how do you do this well? And then finally, can we design non-creepy digital interventions? That's a technical term, based on tracking building occupant states and behaviors. So we don't want, for example, James is stressed, so cool jazz is playing in my office and the lights are out and my boss is like, oh, Landay, he's stressed again. So how do we have people in control and not in a way where they feel it's surveillance? So there's many great applications where we can use AI to help people be better at their tasks, better learners, better designers, or take better care of their body. The key is to keep the user's needs at the center of these smart interface designs. We are really in the early days of finding the right metaphors to allow users to understand what these smart systems are doing and how best to interact with them. So I thank you for your attention. I think we still have time for questions.
Great, thanks, James. That was a really fantastic presentation and really a lot of inspiring examples about how AI can be used in ways that really have a positive impact on people. I think we often hear a lot of doom stories about AI, so it's good to also think about where it can be beneficial. There's quite a few questions, so I'm going to jump right into it and take some from the audience. I'm bundling a few different questions into one here, just in the interest of time.
Okay.
On the education piece, there were a number of questions there about whether you have enough data to make different comments about how children of different ages respond differently to multi-chapter stories or more complex narratives. And a second question I want to put in there as well is, you mentioned as well, there's a really big impact on the low performers. Are you any at all concerned about impact on the high performers? And some suggested that there might be a potential for a decrease in their performance through using a system.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I don't think we have a lot of data to be able to say whether the stories impact the different age groups differently. I mean, we don't see a difference, when we have, in that 72-person study, about a third of the students are each in those 3 grades of 3, 4, and 5. We didn't see any particular differences in their engagement levels measured 2 different ways. Both engagement levels were self-report from the student, but we also had judges who used a methodology where they look at the face in the video without seeing what condition they're in, and are able to try to track what their engagement is. And so we don't really see a difference in that. Now, again, this is a short lab study where they're using the thing for about an hour. You need to really get out into real longitudinal studies where they're using things over longer periods of time, probably to see any real effect like that, I think. In terms of whether we're working for the higher or lower level, I think one thing is the system as it is now is not the Envision system that's much more adaptive to the particular knowledge level of the student, and therefore, giving them content that is, just harder than what they already know, which is kind of a known technique in education circles. So it's not at that level yet. So I think it makes sense that, you're going to see a bigger effect for the kids who it was really at the right level to teach them something they didn't already know. So we see the kids who didn't already know the material actually had a big gain on their post-test. But if they already knew it, they're likely to have a higher pre-test score and a higher post-test score, and therefore you're just not going to see the gain. But in a real adaptive system, those kids wouldn't have seen the same problems and same content. They probably would have got something that was more challenging to them. So I think for kids, independent of what their level is, we should be able to help them improve. So I'm not really worried about that long term. I think that's more of a artifact of just the study being focused on, one multi-part problem at a certain level, and the kids are at different levels than that.
And are you able to comment at all on sort of the impact on underrepresented groups, or are you not at that stage yet?
I mean, I don't, we did try to make sure we had a fairly diverse sample in the larger online study that we did. I think the study we did in the lab is more biased by you're getting kids locally in Palo Alto and Mountain View and Silicon Valley, so harder to control. Whereas the online study, we have kids from all over the United States. We have much better racial balance, and we also I also have the students recruiting on this look for certain geographies and zip codes to kind of see that we got more socioeconomic balance. I don't know if there's enough analysis of that data or enough data to be able to make broad conclusions about differences among those populations. Again, I think that would require a much more widely deployed system with more data to really see what differences might be there, whether it would help people who are in a less high socioeconomic background, or whether it hurt. I don't really know. I would hope it helps, but I can't really say.
So changing gears a little bit, there's a question about whether the emphasis in technology is or should be more on impacting motivation. So trying to get people, change behaviors that aren't as motivated, or whether the focus should be more on providing tools for people who already are motivated and just need to sort of, have something to help them continue on.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. My view was really that a lot of the things that already exist in the system are already targeted at people who are already motivated. So if you look at your kids in school, especially in a place like where my kids are here in Palo Alto, it is so focused on those kids who are totally motivated, wanting to get A's, wanting to do the best. And if you look at online education like MOOCs, who did we see they worked for? They open up access to people who maybe didn't have access, but they were the people who, had we brought them to the Stanford campus, they probably would have done well. already. So they were motivated. Often people who already had a degree and they wanted to go learn this other skill. In some ways, they replaced kind of what people maybe used to do at community colleges and UC Extension while they had a job. They did open up access to people who came from other countries and stuff where they maybe didn't have access to this, but those were highly motivated people to do it and go after it. So my claim was a lot of the technology that's out there is already kind of, and systems are already set up for those folks. And I personally was more interested feeling like there are a lot of people who just don't fit into the system, get spit out, and are not really reaching their potential in life that they might be. So how could we spark some interest in learning in a different way with those that may translate back into the traditional system? So maybe they get motivated playing through some system like this that then translates back into their normal school life. We aren't trying to replace school necessarily, but maybe just speak to a population that is less connected and interested in the current system.
So I think we have time for one more question, and I wanted to shift gears a little bit to talk about your third use case, which was, the environment and smart buildings and so on. And the question here is, the person asks that inferences of emotion and mood and so on are often trained on self-reports of people's, subjective state. And if you have a model that's trained on, one population, but then you're applying it to a different population, could you end up with situations where the people for whom the system is making inferences, were not included in the training data, and so maybe the system's not actually making inferences that match up with the actual mood or state of the individuals?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there is definitely some fraught cases with this kind of technology, similar to what we've already seen from face recognition technology of not working properly with different races, and also being misused in ways that we wouldn't like it to be. So, I think there are a lot of people, I'm reading, there are people who are really opposed to any kind of emotion technology. I think there are physiologically sensed data that we know correlates well with stress, for example, like heart rate variability. Again, there's always going to be exceptions to these things. I think you don't want to only do self-report. You also want to have some real other signals, and you also maybe even want humans like judging what some emotion is, because that's how we judge right now. When we see another person, I can say, oh, he seems angry. I'm not always right. In fact, they say I'm angry all the time. They're not always right. I don't smile enough. So these things can be fraught. I think we also have to be careful what we use them for, right? So, we've seen instances, for example, in China, where they're looking at kids in the classroom saying, hey, they're not paying attention. And, maybe there's some negative thing that happens about it. I think for this instance, we want to use it to go, I think the person's frustrated. I think this kind of help will help them here. But it's not like, oh, now I'm giving you a lower grade. So, don't use this stuff for serious high stakes things like sentencing or other things that we've seen problems with other AI technology. You want to be very careful how it's used. And again, this is the really early stages of trying to see how it might work. And we have to be skeptical on some of these uses and be careful, or else we'll run into that. So we're actually running workshops this summer. We're really probing these with people and having them design technologies and understanding what their issues are with it. If it ends up that this just doesn't work for people, then yeah, we'll abandon some of those ideas and go to different ways. So it's an important question, but I think it doesn't say don't do any research on it. I think we have to research it to understand the trade-offs and how to make these things work better, because certain companies and stuff, they're just going to go do this anyway. So it's better that we in the universities and research places can do this in an open way and really probe and interrogate these technologies to understand what the implications are.
Well, we've got a lot more questions, but unfortunately we're at time. So James, I want to thank you for taking the time to share your research with us today, and thank the audience for joining us as well.
I encourage folks who didn't have a chance to get their questions asked to send me email. It's just Landay, Landay @stanford.edu, and I'll try to answer those at another time.
Great. Thank you, James.